November 6th, 1895. The bride walked down the aisle, weeping so violently her mother feared she might collapse before reaching the altar. Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old and worth $2.5 million in today's money, was being sold. The groom, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, needed her fortune to save his family's crumbling palace. She needed nothing from him. This was not a wedding. It was a real estate transaction dressed in white silk and orange blossoms, witnessed by New York society and blessed by a church that asked no questions. What happened next would save Blenheim Palace, but destroy the woman who paid for it. Chapter 1. When American Money Learned to Hunt Titles. By 1890, New York's wealthiest families had conquered everything except the one thing money couldn't buy: a pedigree. They owned railroads that spanned continents. They controlled banks that financed nations. They built mansions that rivaled European palaces. But they could not buy their way into the old aristocratic bloodlines that had ruled society for centuries. American industrial money was new, loud, and unwelcome in the drawing rooms of established families who traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. So the Americans looked across the Atlantic and discovered something extraordinary. British aristocrats had what they wanted, and better yet, those aristocrats were broke. The system emerged organically at first, then calcified into an actual market. An impoverished earl needed capital to save his estate. An American railroad baron needed social legitimacy for his family. Between them stood a daughter, trained from birth to be charming, accomplished, and obedient. The transaction was simple. American money would marry British titles. The estates would be saved. The families would be elevated. And the women would become the currency that made it all possible. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1870 and 1890, 9 American heiresses married into British aristocracy, transferring over $40 million across the Atlantic. That figure would more than quintuple over the next 2 decades. These were not love matches discovered at garden parties. These were negotiated contracts with lawyers on both sides. Settlement terms drafted before the couple had spent an hour alone together, and financial arrangements that treated the bride's fortune as the primary asset being acquired. The system worked because both sides needed it desperately. British estates were bleeding money. Agricultural depression had devastated rental income. Death duties and inheritance taxes were gutting aristocratic fortunes. Meanwhile, massive country houses built to display power now demanded constant transfusions of cash just to keep the roofs from collapsing. The aristocrats had land, titles, and social prestige. They did not have liquidity. American industrialists had precisely the opposite problem. They had built unprecedented fortunes in railroads, steel, and banking. What they lacked was the social acceptance that would allow them to forget their grandfathers had been farmers or shopkeepers. The daughters became the bridge. They were raised in Newport mansions, educated by European governesses, taught to speak French and play piano, and move through ballrooms with practiced grace. They learned early that their purpose was not personal happiness, but family advancement. Their mothers managed them like investment portfolios, calculating which European title would yield the highest social return. The girls were chaperoned constantly, their romantic choices monitored and controlled, their eventual marriages negotiated like corporate mergers. And at the center of this transatlantic trade stood one family whose ambition exceeded all others: the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Vanderbilt had died in 1877, leaving a fortune of $100 million built on railroads and shipping. His descendants did not simply possess wealth. They possessed the kind of transformative capital that could save entire estates, finance palace restorations, and permanently alter aristocratic bloodlines. When a Vanderbilt daughter entered the marriage market, European dukes paid attention. Alva Vanderbilt, recently divorced and controlling a personal fortune of $70 million, understood the system perfectly. She had married into the Vanderbilt dynasty and clawed her way into society through sheer force of will and strategic spending. She had built a French chateau on Fifth Avenue just to prove she could. She had hosted costume balls so extravagant they forced old money families to acknowledge her existence. Now she had one final prize to claim. She would marry her daughter to a duke, not a baron or an earl, a duke. And she knew exactly which palace needed saving. Chapter 2: The Girl Worth More Than Her Weight in Gold. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 17 when she realized her mother had been training her for sale, not for life. Every detail of her upbringing had been calculated. The French and German lessons so she could converse with European aristocracy. The deportment training so she could move through palace corridors with appropriate grace. The chaperoned balls in Newport, where titled Europeans happened to be visiting. Even her name had been chosen strategically. Consuelo. Exotic enough to seem sophisticated, memorable enough to stand out in a crowd of American heiresses competing for the same prizes. She was beautiful in the specific way the marriage market demanded. Slender, dark-haired, with the kind of delicate features that photographed well in society pages. Yeah, but her real value lay in the fortune she would inherit. $70 million in Vanderbilt money, controlled by her mother until marriage, then transferring to whatever husband Alva selected. Consuelo herself would never control that money. It existed only to be traded. Her childhood had been lonely and strange, raised primarily by governesses while her mother orchestrated social campaigns. Moved between mansions in New York, Newport, and Paris, depending on where Alva needed to be seen. Educated obsessively in everything except how to have opinions or make choices. She learned to paint, to sing, to discuss literature in 3 languages. She was never taught to expect happiness or autonomy. Those were not assets the market valued. At 17, she fell in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He came from an old New York family with impeccable lineage, but limited money. By the standards of American society, he was an excellent match. Handsome, educated, from the exact social class Alva herself had fought to enter. But he had one disqualifying characteristic. He was not European. He carried no title. Marrying him would waste Consuelo's value. Alva discovered their romance and responded with surgical precision. She removed Consuelo from New York society, citing the need for an extended European tour. She flooded her daughter's schedule with chaperoned events designed to introduce her to titled men. She monitored every letter, every conversation, every moment Consuelo was not directly supervised, and she began negotiating behind the scenes, searching for the perfect duke to receive her investment. The European tour of 1894 was not a vacation. It was a marriage market operation. Alva brought Consuelo to London, Paris, and the country estates where impoverished aristocrats lived in crumbling grandeur. At each stop, young men with impressive titles and empty bank accounts appeared for carefully orchestrated introductions. Consuelo moved through the process in a state of quiet despair, understanding finally what she was: not a daughter, not a person, an asset to be liquidated at maximum value. She tried to resist. She wrote letters to Rutherford that were intercepted before they could be mailed. She pleaded with her mother to reconsider, to allow her to marry for love like other American girls. Alva's response was always the same. Sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. The Vanderbilt name demanded representation at the highest levels of society. Love was irrelevant. Duty was everything. Consuelo learned to smile at the right moments, to dance with the right partners, to express polite interest in the histories of estates she would never choose to inhabit. But inside, she was calculating escape routes that did not exist. She was 17 years old, legally controlled by her mother, financially dependent and socially isolated. The only choice available to her was which prison to accept. And then Alva found the perfect candidate. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. 23 years old, educated at Cambridge, heir to one of England's most spectacular palaces. Handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, utterly broke, and desperately searching for an American heiress willing to trade her fortune for his title. The negotiation could begin. Chapter 3. The Palace that Demanded a Fortune. Blenheim Palace was dying, and everyone who lived there knew it, but refused to say it aloud. Built between 1705 and 1722, Blenheim was not designed for comfort or efficiency. It was designed to make a political statement. John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, had defeated the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, saving England from invasion. A grateful nation rewarded him with land, money, and permission to build a palace that would permanently commemorate his victory. What emerged was one of the largest private residences ever constructed in Britain. The numbers were staggering, even by aristocratic standards. 200 rooms spread across 7 acres of floor space. The main facade stretched 528 feet, longer than Buckingham Palace. The entrance hall rose 67 feet to a painted ceiling depicting Marlborough's military triumphs. The library held 10,000 volumes in a room 183 feet long. The grounds covered 2,700 acres, landscaped by Capability Brown into artificial lakes, ornamental bridges, and sculpted forests that existed purely for aesthetic effect. It was glorious. It was also completely unsustainable. By the time the 9th Duke inherited Blenheim in 1892, the palace had become a financial black hole, consuming everything fed into it. The roof was failing across multiple sections, allowing rain to damage ceilings and walls. The heating system, installed in the 1850s, was collapsing. Electrical wiring was non-existent. The staff required to maintain basic operations numbered over 50 people, whose wages had to be paid regardless of the estate's income. And the estate's income was vanishing. British agriculture had been in crisis since the 1870s. American grain imports had destroyed the profitability of English farming. The tenant farms that had once generated reliable rent now struggled to break even. The 9th Duke inherited debts totaling £300,000, roughly $36 million in modern terms. The palace itself generated no income. It simply consumed money through necessary repairs, staff wages, heating costs, and the basic maintenance required to prevent total collapse. The Duke understood his situation with perfect clarity. He could not sell Blenheim. It was entailed, legally bound to the title and the bloodline. He could not abandon it. Aristocratic duty demanded he preserve the family seat for future generations. He could not maintain it with existing resources. The math simply did not work. Agricultural rents would never cover operational costs, plus repairs, plus debt service. He needed an immediate infusion of capital large enough to stabilize the estate and generate perpetual income. He needed an American heiress. The palace demanded this sacrifice. Its 200 rooms required constant heating in winter, constant staffing year-round, and constant repairs to keep ahead of decay. Water damage had destroyed ornamental plasterwork in the state dining room. The roof above the long library leaked during every substantial rain. The Column of Victory, a 134-foot monument on the grounds, needed urgent structural work to prevent collapse. Each problem cost thousands of pounds to address. Ignoring them meant accelerating destruction of an irreplaceable architectural masterpiece. The ninth Duke had options other aristocrats lacked. He was young, unmarried, and held one of the most prestigious titles in England. The Duke of Marlborough name carried weight in society and politics. His family connection to Winston Churchill, his cousin, added modern relevance to historical glory. If he could find the right American heiress, one whose fortune was large enough to solve his problems permanently, he could save Blenheim without sacrificing anything except his romantic autonomy. And romantic autonomy seemed a small price to pay for preserving 300 years of family history. He began making inquiries through social networks. Which American families had daughters of marriageable age? Which fortunes were large enough to meet his needs? Which mothers were ambitious enough to negotiate frankly? The search led him directly to Alva Vanderbilt. Her daughter Consuelo was 18, beautiful, impeccably educated, and worth millions. Her mother was known for social ambition that bordered on obsession. The match seemed perfect. In spring of 1895, the Duke traveled to New York on what was publicly described as a social visit. Privately, he came to inspect the merchandise and begin negotiations. Blenheim Palace needed saving. Consuelo Vanderbilt had the fortune to save it. All that remained was setting the price. Chapter 4. The negotiation that named its price. Marriage contracts are supposed to unite families, but this one read like a corporate merger with human collateral. The settlement negotiations began in June of 1895 and concluded 3 months later with documents that spelled out exactly how much Consuelo Vanderbilt was worth, not to the Duke personally, to Blenheim Palace and the perpetuation of the Churchill family line. The lawyers on both sides approached the transaction with the same clinical precision they would bring to a railway acquisition or banking consolidation. Human happiness was not a category that appeared in their contracts. Alva's terms were straightforward. She would transfer $2.5 million in New York Central Railroad stock to a trust that would generate £50,000 in annual income. Control of this trust would belong to the Duke, not to Consuelo. The income would cover operational costs at Blenheim, service existing debts, and finance necessary repairs. In exchange, the Duke would marry Consuelo, produce heirs, and grant her the social position of Duchess of Marlborough. The stock itself would only revert to Consuelo's control after she had produced male heirs, ensuring the Churchill line continued. If she failed to produce sons, or if she died in childbirth, the stock remained permanently with the Duke's estate. The Duke's lawyers countered with additional requirements. They wanted guarantees about the stock's performance, any stipulations about what happened if railroad dividends declined, and clauses protecting the Duke's control over any future children. Alva's lawyers responded with their own demands. They wanted assurances about Consuelo's rank within British society, her treatment within the family, and her access to the Duke's properties. Both sides negotiated as if the bride were a complex financial instrument requiring detailed terms and conditions. Consuelo was not present for these discussions, neither was the Duke. The negotiations happened between attorneys who had never met the couple and cared nothing about their compatibility. The marriage itself was almost incidental to the transaction. What mattered was the money, the title, the heirs, and the palace. The people involved were simply the mechanisms through which these assets would be transferred and secured. While lawyers argued over decimal points, Alva was waging a different battle. She had discovered that Consuelo was still secretly communicating with Winthrop Rutherford. Letters were being smuggled past the household staff. Messages were being passed through sympathetic friends. Consuelo had not surrendered. She was actively resisting the marriage her mother had designed. Alva responded with tactics that would decades later be legally classified as coercion. She began with emotional manipulation, long conversations about family duty, reminders of everything Alva had sacrificed to elevate the Vanderbilt name, suggestions that Consuelo's refusal would destroy her mother's life work and social position. When guilt failed to break Consuelo's resistance, Alva escalated to threats. She claimed that the stress of defiance was affecting her health. She consulted physicians who conveniently diagnosed her with a serious heart condition. She began staging episodes of chest pain and difficulty breathing, always when Consuelo was present to witness her mother's apparent suffering. The message was explicit. If Consuelo refused the marriage, Alva would die. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not literally, but she would decline, she would suffer, and the responsibility would belong entirely to her disobedient daughter. Consuelo found herself trapped between two impossible choices: marry a man she did not love and abandon any hope of personal happiness, or refuse the marriage and live with the knowledge that she had killed her mother through selfish defiance. The psychological warfare intensified in August when the Duke arrived for what was publicly called a courtship, but functioned more like a final inspection. He spent 2 weeks at the Vanderbilt summer estate in Newport, Rhode Island, surrounded by chaperones and under constant observation. He was charming in the specific way aristocrats learn to be charming: polite, attentive in public, completely cold when alone with Consuelo. He made no pretense of affection or attraction. This was a business arrangement, and he discussed it with brutal honesty. During one of their few private conversations, he explained his financial situation completely. The debts, the failing roof, the impossible choice between selling irreplaceable furniture or watching the palace decay. He needed her money, and he was willing to marry her to get it. In exchange, she would become a duchess, live in one of England's great houses, and occupy a position of genuine social importance. It was, he suggested, a fair trade. He offered title and position. She offered capital and heirs. Neither needed to pretend this involved love. Consuelo listened to this clinical explanation of her future and understood finally that resistance was pointless. Her mother controlled her legally until she married. Rutherford had no fortune to support her if she ran away. British society would shun her if she broke an engagement to a duke. American society would consider her a failure if she refused such an advantageous match. And underneath all the rational arguments lay her mother's increasingly convincing performance of cardiac distress. In September, she surrendered. She agreed to the engagement. The lawyers finalized the settlement terms. The wedding date was set for November. And Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old and legally a child under American law, signed documents that would transfer her fortune to a man she had known for 3 months and who had never pretended to love her. The negotiation was complete. The price had been named: $2.5 million for a title, a palace, and the destruction of a woman's autonomy. Chapter 5. The week she learned. She had no choice. They locked her in her bedroom for 5 days while her mother negotiated the terms of her surrender. The engagement had been announced publicly. The settlement papers had been signed. But Consuelo had not given up on Winthrop Rutherford. In late October, less than 2 weeks before the wedding, she made one final attempt to escape. She wrote him a letter explaining everything: the coercion, the threats, her mother's manufactured illness, the financial arrangements that treated her like inventory. She begged him to help her break free. She promised to give up her fortune, her family, everything if he would only take her away. The letter was intercepted before it left the house. Alva's staff, loyal to their employer and well compensated for their surveillance, brought it directly to her. Alva read it, understood immediately that her daughter had not been broken, and responded with overwhelming force. She confined Consuelo to her bedroom, not as punishment, as containment. Guards were posted outside the door with orders to prevent escape. Meals were brought up. Correspondence was forbidden. Visitors were denied. For 5 days, Consuelo Vanderbilt lived under house arrest in her own home, while her mother worked to eliminate her last chance at freedom. Alva sent word to Rutherford, not a threat, simply information. The marriage would proceed as planned. Any attempt to interfere would be met with social destruction. Rutherford was from old New York society, the very establishment Alva had spent decades forcing to accept her. She knew exactly how to pressure him. His family's position depended on maintaining good relations with powerful dynasties. Fighting the Vanderbilts publicly would destroy him. He had no fortune to compensate for lost social standing, and he had no legal claim to Consuelo. They were not engaged. They had no formal understanding. He was simply a young man who had written letters to a girl whose mother had decided otherwise. Rutherford backed down. Years later, he would marry someone else. But in October of 1895, he chose his family's future over Consuelo's freedom. The message reached Alva within 2 days. The threat was neutralized. Consuelo had no rescuer coming. Meanwhile, Alva consulted physicians about her conveniently timed heart condition. They examined her, asked careful questions about symptoms, and provided the diagnosis she needed: severe nervous exhaustion with cardiac complications. Any significant stress could prove fatal. The prescription was clear. Consuelo must eliminate sources of maternal distress by proceeding with the marriage as planned. The doctors, compensated generously for their services, put their recommendations in writing. Medical testimony that could be produced if questions were later raised about coercion. On the 5th day of her confinement, Consuelo was released from her room for a private conversation with her mother. Alva did not shout or threaten. She simply presented facts. Rutherford had withdrawn. The marriage could not be stopped without destroying the family's reputation. The Duke was waiting in England for confirmation that the wedding would proceed, and Alva's health would not survive the scandal of a broken engagement. Every avenue of escape had been systematically sealed. Surrender or watch everything collapse. Consuelo asked one question. If she went through with the wedding, would her mother stop the chest pains and the fainting spells? Alva promised she would. The bargain was explicit. Consuelo's obedience in exchange for her mother's survival. a transaction disguised as maternal love. The Duke arrived in New York 3 days before the wedding. His role now was purely ceremonial. The legal and financial arrangements were complete. He needed only to appear at the church, speak his vows, and take possession of his purchased bride. He stayed at a hotel, not with the Vanderbilts. He attended pre-wedding events with the enthusiasm of a man reviewing contracts. He showed no interest in Consuelo personally, only in ensuring the schedule proceeded without complications. During their one private conversation that week, he told her what to expect. They would marry at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. The honeymoon would be spent traveling to England, and she would be presented to British society as the new Duchess of Marlborough. She would learn to manage Blenheim's social obligations. She would produce heirs. He did not promise affection or companionship. He promised a role, a title, and a place within one of England's great families. That, he suggested, should be sufficient compensation for her fortune. Consuelo asked if he loved her. The Duke looked genuinely confused by the question. Love was not a relevant category for aristocratic marriages. Affection might develop over time. It might not. What mattered was duty, lineage, and the preservation of estates. She would understand this better once she saw Blenheim and recognized what her money would save. The palace itself would explain why personal happiness was an acceptable sacrifice. The night before the wedding, Consuelo sat in her bedroom surrounded by the elaborate trousseau Alva had commissioned. Silk gowns for presentation at court, traveling clothes for the voyage to England, formal wear for Blenheim's endless dinners and social events. Every item had been chosen to display Vanderbilt wealth and justify the Duke's investment. She was being packaged for delivery like an expensive commodity, wrapped in white silk and orange blossoms. She considered running, simply leaving in the night and disappearing into New York's anonymous crowds. But she had no money of her own, no skills that would support her, no allies who would hide her from her mother's investigators. And underneath every practical obstacle lay the final, inescapable trap. She believed Alva's doctors. She believed the heart condition was real. She believed that her defiance would kill her mother. Whether the illness was genuine or performed did not matter. The trap had closed completely. November 6th, 1895. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle of St. Thomas Church and surrender everything she was for everything she was worth. Chapter 6. The wedding that made society look away. Everyone in St. Thomas Church that morning knew they were witnessing a crime, but they called it a celebration. 2,000 guests filled the pews. Every major family in New York society had sent representatives. The press crowded the streets outside, describing the scene for newspapers that would circulate the story across America. The church had been decorated with thousands of white roses and orchids, in transforming the space into a fragrant bower that smelled like a funeral despite being staged as a wedding. And at the center of it all, walking down the aisle in a gown that cost $6,000, was an 18-year-old girl crying so hard she could barely see. Consuelo's tears were not discreet or hidden. They ran down her face in streams, ruining her careful makeup, making her veil stick to her wet cheeks. She sobbed audibly as she walked. Her mother, walking beside her in the role of escort, gripped her arm so tightly that bruises would appear later. Alva smiled for the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, performing perfect maternal pride. But her hand on Consuelo's arm was iron. Walk forward. Do not stop. Do not speak. Complete the transaction. The guests pretended not to notice. This was the skill aristocratic society had perfected over centuries. The ability to observe horror and call it tradition, to witness coercion and classify it as duty. Every person in that church understood what was happening. The marriage had been negotiated for money. The bride had been forced into compliance. The groom was purchasing a fortune disguised as a woman. But no one spoke these truths aloud. Instead, they focused on the beauty of the flowers, the elegance of the bride's gown, the prestigious match being celebrated. The Duke waited at the altar with perfect composure. He wore formal mourning dress, appropriate for a wedding, expensive enough to suggest aristocratic status. He watched his bride approach with the expression of a man receiving a delivery he had paid for in advance. When Consuelo reached the altar, still crying, still being held upright by her mother's grip, he offered no comfort. He simply turned to face the minister and prepared to speak the vows that would legally transfer Consuelo's fortune into his control. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical efficiency. The minister spoke the traditional words. Consuelo repeated her vows in a voice so quiet the front rows could barely hear her. The Duke spoke his promises clearly, each phrase a contractual acknowledgement. When the minister pronounced them married, the church erupted in polite applause. The couple walked back down the aisle, now legally bound, and Consuelo's tears continued to fall. The photographers outside captured her crying face. The newspapers would publish those images alongside headlines celebrating the union of American wealth and British aristocracy. The reception at the Vanderbilt mansion featured champagne, orchestra music, and 500 guests congratulating Alva on her triumph. She had achieved what she had spent years planning. Her daughter was a duchess. The Vanderbilt name was now connected to one of England's most prestigious titles. Social victory had been purchased with Consuelo's freedom, and Alva considered it an excellent trade. She moved through the reception, accepting compliments, basking in the success of her campaign, while her daughter sat silent and numb at the head table. The Duke performed his social obligations with practiced ease. He thanked guests for attending. He made appropriate remarks about the honor of joining two great families. He smiled for photographs while standing next to his crying bride. When asked about their honeymoon plans, then he described the voyage to England and their upcoming residence at Blenheim Palace. He spoke about the future as if it were already settled, which legally it was. The marriage could not be undone. The fortune was now his to control. Consuelo had been successfully acquired. They left for their honeymoon voyage that evening. The ship departed New York Harbor while crowds on the dock waved farewell. Consuelo stood on deck, watching America disappear, understanding that she was leaving behind everything she had known: her home, her language, her chance at happiness with Rutherford, her entire identity as Consuelo Vanderbilt. From now on, she would be the Duchess of Marlborough, a title that described her function, not her person. The voyage across the Atlantic took 7 days. In 7 days locked in a cabin with a man who had married her for money and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The Duke spent most of the journey reading or writing correspondence. When he spoke to Consuelo, it was to criticize. Her posture was wrong. Her French accent needed improvement. She did not understand proper etiquette for addressing servants. She failed to recognize that being a duchess required constant performance of aristocratic standards she had not been raised to know. On the third night of the voyage, the Duke explained the sleeping arrangements at Blenheim. They would maintain separate bedrooms, meeting only when conception of an heir was the goal. This was standard practice in aristocratic marriages. Affection was unnecessary. Physical intimacy would be scheduled and efficient, designed to produce sons who would inherit the title and the estate her money had saved. Once she had provided male heirs, her primary duty would be complete. She could then occupy herself with charity work or social activities while he attended to estate management and his own personal interests. Consuelo asked what those personal interests included. The Duke smiled for the first time since the wedding. He enjoyed art collecting, hunting, and the company of people who understood aristocratic culture. He was particularly fond of a woman named Gladys Deacon, an American expatriate living in Europe who shared his aesthetic sensibilities. Consuelo understood immediately. Her husband had a mistress, possibly not yet consummated, but waiting. A relationship built on actual compatibility and attraction, everything her marriage lacked. The ship reached England on November 13th. A carriage was waiting to transport them from Southampton to Oxfordshire, a journey of several hours through countryside that grew increasingly rural as they traveled north. The Duke pointed out landmarks with the tone of a tour guide, villages that had stood for centuries, estates owned by families who had never needed American money to survive. The landscape of old England that viewed her kind with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. They arrived at Blenheim Palace at sunset. Consuelo's first glimpse came as the carriage rounded a curve, and the entire facade appeared across an artificial lake. 200 rooms, 528 feet of stone, towers and columns and carved ornaments covering every surface. The palace was magnificent, it was overwhelming, and it was hers, purchased with her freedom at a price of $2.5 million. The Duke helped her from the carriage with cold courtesy. The staff stood assembled to greet their new duchess. And Consuelo Vanderbilt walked through the entrance of Blenheim Palace, understanding finally what she had bought for the Duke and what the Duke had bought from her. This building would consume the rest of her life. Chapter 7. The Palace That Swallowed Millions. Blenheim Palace consumed her fortune the way it consumed everything. Room by room, repair by repair, without gratitude or end. The restoration work began immediately. The Duke had waited months to access Consuelo's dowry, postponing urgent repairs until the marriage was complete and the money legally his. Now the projects could proceed, so the roof above the east wing required complete replacement. Cost, £100,000. The electrical system needed to be installed throughout the palace, wiring 200 rooms that had never known anything except candlelight and gas lamps. Cost, £40,000. The staterooms demanded redecorating to restore them to their original grandeur, replacing damaged silk wall coverings and rotted wooden paneling. Cost, £30,000. The money flowed out in a constant stream. Contractors arrived to assess damage. Craftsmen were hired to match 18th century techniques. Materials were sourced from across Europe. The Duke oversaw every detail personally, not because he cared about Consuelo's investment, but because Blenheim's restoration was the purpose of their marriage. She was not his wife, but she was the funding mechanism for his palace. Consuelo was expected to appear at breakfast each morning in full formal dress, hair arranged, jewelry selected, posture perfect. Breakfast at Blenheim was not a casual meal. It was a performance of aristocratic normalcy, even when only she and the Duke were present. He would read correspondence while she sat in silence. Occasionally, he would mention a repair project or a social obligation. Mostly he ignored her. lunch required another costume change. Afternoon dress, different jewelry, the same perfect posture. Then tea, which demanded yet another outfit. Then dinner, the most elaborate performance of all. Full evening gown, formal jewels, 4 courses served by footmen who had been trained to move through the dining room without making sound. The Duke would invite guests several nights a week. Local aristocrats, political connections, people who mattered to his position. Consuelo was expected to entertain them, to be charming and intelligent, but never too knowledgeable, decorative but not distracting. She was a duchess. Her role was display. Between meals and social obligations, she was largely ignored. The Duke had his own apartments where she was not welcome. He spent his days managing the estate, meeting with his steward, reviewing accounts that she was forbidden from seeing. The Restoration consumed her fortune, but she was granted no voice in how it was spent. She was the source of capital, not a partner in its deployment. Her signature had transferred control to the Duke. Now she existed only to maintain appearances while he spent her inheritance. The isolation was crushing. Blenheim employed over 50 staff members, but Consuelo was not allowed to befriend them. Aristocratic protocol demanded distance between duchess and servants. The local gentry called on her, but these were formal visits governed by rules she was still learning. She made mistakes constantly, using the wrong form of address, sitting in the wrong chair, expressing opinions on topics duchesses were not supposed to discuss. Each error was corrected by the Duke with cold precision. She was embarrassing him. She needed to learn faster. Within 6 months of marriage, she understood the trap completely. She could not leave. British law granted husbands complete control over their wives' property and movements. She could not access her own money. The Duke controlled the trust that held her fortune. She could not even return to America without his permission. He owned her legally in ways that American law was beginning to prohibit, but British law still enforced. And underneath the legal constraints lay the social ones. Divorce was scandalous. Separation was shameful. A duchess who fled her responsibilities would be shunned by the very society she had been sold into. In 1897, she gave birth to their first son, John Albert, Edward, William Spencer Churchill, Marquis of Blandford, heir to the dukedom and to Blenheim itself. The pregnancy had been difficult. The birth was worse. Aristocratic protocol required male physicians who had never met her before. No pain relief beyond laudanum. The expectation that she would suffer in silence because suffering was a woman's duty. She survived. The baby survived. And the Duke's response was immediate satisfaction that she had proven capable of producing male heirs. 1900 brought their second son, Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill. 2 male heirs secured the succession and completed Consuelo's primary obligation. The Duke could now relax, knowing that his line was protected and Blenheim's future was guaranteed. He began spending more time away from the palace. Trips to London, extended stays at other estates. He was always vague about his activities, and Consuelo had learned not to ask questions. She discovered the affair in 1902. Gladys Deacon, the woman he had mentioned during their honeymoon, was now his acknowledged mistress, not hidden or secret. Simply a fact of his life that he saw no reason to conceal from his wife. Gladys visited Blenheim regularly. She sat at Consuelo's dinner table. She walked through rooms that had been restored with Vanderbilt money, and the Duke made no effort to hide his preference. Gladys understood him. She shared his interests. She made him happy in ways his American wife never could. Consuelo was expected to tolerate this arrangement without complaint. Affairs were normal in aristocratic marriages. Her role was to maintain the household, raise the heirs, and perform social obligations. His role was to manage the estate and pursue whatever personal happiness he could find. That he found it with another woman was unfortunate for Consuelo, but irrelevant to their contractual obligations. The marriage continued. The palace continued to consume money. And Consuelo learned that she had not just been sold, she had been permanently purchased. By 1905, the major restoration work was complete. Blenheim Palace gleamed with renewed grandeur. The roof was sound. The electrical system functioned perfectly. The state rooms had been returned to 18th century splendor. Visitors touring the palace marveled at its beauty, never knowing that an American girl's fortune had saved it from collapse. The Duke entertained constantly, hosting hunting parties and political gatherings and social events that displayed Blenheim's magnificence. And Consuelo presided over these events as the duchess who had made it all possible, smiling for guests while dying inside. The palace had swallowed millions and would demand millions more. Maintenance was endless. Heating costs alone consumed thousands of pounds annually. Staff wages continued year after year. Yet small repairs became large repairs became replacement projects. Blenheim was saved, but it would never be finished needing money. It was a monument that fed on fortunes and repaid nothing except the privilege of saying you had preserved it. Consuelo had purchased that privilege. Now she was learning what it cost to maintain. Chapter 8. When she stopped pretending to be happy. 1906. 2 sons born, millions spent, palace restored, and Consuelo Vanderbilt finally stopped smiling for the cameras. The breaking point came slowly, then all at once. Years of performing happiness while living in emotional imprisonment. Years of watching her fortune disappear into a building that would never acknowledge her sacrifice. Years of being treated as an employee rather than a wife, a womb rather than a person, like something inside her calcified into quiet rebellion. She would not leave. She could not leave, but she would stop pretending this was acceptable. She began by learning how her money was actually being spent. The Duke kept her excluded from financial discussions, but estate records were not secrets. She befriended the steward, asking questions about operational costs and repair budgets. She reviewed trust documents, understanding finally how her fortune had been structured to deny her any control. She studied Blenheim's accounts, tracking every pound spent from the income her dowry generated. What she discovered enraged her. The Duke was not simply maintaining Blenheim. He was living extravagantly off her money while claiming poverty whenever she requested anything. His mistress Gladys Deacon received gifts purchased with funds from Consuelo's trust. His hunting parties cost thousands of pounds for entertainment he claimed was necessary for political networking. His art collection grew steadily, each new acquisition justified as an investment, but never generating actual returns. Meanwhile, Consuelo was denied control over even small household expenses. She was funding his lifestyle while being treated as a dependent. She started documenting everything: dates of his absences, names of women he entertained when away from Blenheim, financial expenditures that had nothing to do with palace maintenance, letters he wrote that revealed his contempt for her. She was building a case, though she did not yet know what she would do with it. Or simply collecting evidence gave her a sense of agency she had not felt since her wedding day. In 1907, she befriended members of the women's suffrage movement. British suffragettes were fighting for the right to vote, challenging the legal structures that gave husbands total control over wives. Consuelo attended meetings quietly, listening to women describe the exact imprisonment she was living. They spoke about property rights, custody rights, the inability to leave abusive marriages without losing everything. They spoke about being legal possessions rather than legal persons. Consuelo understood every word. She began charitable work in the villages surrounding Blenheim, visiting tenant families, funding education for poor children, establishing a medical clinic for workers who could not afford doctors. The Duke approved these activities because they enhanced Blenheim's reputation as a benevolent estate. He did not realize Consuelo was building a network of allies. People who saw her kindness and would remember it. People who would support her if she ever needed witnesses to testify about the Duke's character and her own. The palace staff became her intelligence network. They saw everything. The Duke's late-night arrivals with women who were not his wife. His violent tempers when household management displeased him. His dismissive treatment of Consuelo in private, so different from his polite performance in public. The servants liked the Duchess. She treated them as people, not furniture. They told her things. Small details that built a larger picture of a man who had married for money and felt entitled to spend it however he wished, without gratitude or restraint. In 1908, Consuelo told the Duke she wanted a separation, not a divorce. British law made divorce nearly impossible, requiring proof of adultery, plus additional offenses. But separation was achievable. They could live apart. She could remove herself from Blenheim and from his daily control. She would maintain her title and her position as mother to his heirs, but she would no longer perform the charade of being his wife. The Duke refused immediately. Separation would create scandal. It would damage his political ambitions. It would suggest fault on his part, undermining his reputation as a responsible aristocrat, preserving his family's heritage. And most importantly, separation would complicate his financial control. The trust required review if their marriage dissolved. Lawyers might scrutinize how he had spent her fortune. Questions might be raised about whether he had fulfilled his contractual obligations. He needed her to remain silently compliant. His counteroffer revealed everything about how he viewed their marriage. She could have her separation when she provided proof that their sons were legitimate heirs, not biological proof, that was obvious, but legal proof that could withstand any future challenge. Documentation that would prevent rivals from claiming the sons were not actually fathered by the Duke. Until such proof existed, she would remain at Blenheim, maintaining appearances and preventing any suggestion of scandal that could threaten the succession. Consuelo understood the trap. Under British law at the time, children belonged to their father. If she left, the Duke retained custody. She would lose access to her sons. They would be raised at Blenheim, taught to view their mother as the woman who had abandoned her duties. She could fight for custody, but aristocratic courts favored aristocratic fathers. A duchess who fled her responsibilities would not win sympathy from judges who believed women existed to serve their husbands and preserve family estates. She was trapped by her children the way she had been trapped by her mother's manufactured heart attack. Leave and lose everything. Stay and continue suffering. The Duke had found the perfect leverage. She loved her sons. She would not abandon them to his sole influence. So she remained at Blenheim, but she stopped hiding her misery. The photographs from this period show the change. Earlier portraits had shown her smiling, performing the happy duchess. Now her face was blank. She sat for formal photographs because protocol demanded it. But she no longer pretended joy. The camera captured a woman going through motions, fulfilling obligations, existing in a state of suspended animation while waiting for an opportunity that might never come. She continued her documentation, continued her charitable work, continued building networks of support, and she waited, not patiently, not hopefully, but with the grim determination of someone who understands that escape requires preparation, that freedom has a price, and that eventually the Duke would make a mistake that would give her leverage to finally break free. Turn Chapter 9, The Escape That Required Another Fortune. It took Consuelo 20 years to understand what her mother had known all along. Everything has a price, including freedom. The separation negotiations began in 1913, paused during World War I, and finally concluded in 1921. 8 years of legal maneuvering. 8 years of the Duke extracting every possible concession before he would agree to release her from the marriage that had served its purpose. He had her money. The palace was saved. His sons were grown and established as heirs. Consuelo herself was no longer necessary, but he would not let her go cheaply. His opening demand was staggering. He would grant legal separation only if she established a new trust that would permanently fund Blenheim's maintenance. Not temporarily, not for his lifetime, forever. The palace would continue consuming Vanderbilt money long after both of them were dead. The cost, £100,000, roughly $12 million in modern terms, placed in a perpetual maintenance fund that would generate income for estate operations. Consuelo's lawyers argued this was extortion. She had already provided $2.5 million. She had funded the complete restoration. She had given him heirs. British law did not require wives to pay for separation from husbands who had openly maintained mistresses. But the Duke's lawyers countered with threats. Fight the separation in court, and they would make the proceedings public. Every detail of the marriage would be examined. Consuelo's correspondence with Rutherford before the wedding. Her relationships with suffragettes. In her activities that could be characterized as political rather than appropriately feminine. They would destroy her reputation while the Duke played the wronged husband, forced to endure an American wife who never understood British culture. Consuelo was not intimidated by reputation damage. She was intimidated by custody law. The Duke still controlled access to their sons. If she fought publicly, he could restrict her visitation. He could poison the boys against her. He could use his aristocratic connections to ensure she was painted as the villain, while he remained the respectable Duke, preserving family tradition. She was fighting from a position of legal weakness in a system designed to favor husbands absolutely. The negotiation dragged on for years. Her lawyers argued over the trust terms. His lawyers demanded additional clauses guaranteeing his control over estate management. Meanwhile, World War I erupted and delayed everything. Consuelo threw herself into war work, running field hospitals in France, organizing relief efforts, finding purpose in serving something beyond palace maintenance. The Duke remained at Blenheim, protecting the estate from wartime shortages and positioning himself as a patriotic aristocrat supporting the war effort from his country seat. When negotiations resumed after the war, both sides were exhausted. Consuelo agreed to the trust, £100,000 to be permanently invested, generating income that would flow to Blenheim's maintenance fund forever. The palace she had already purchased would continue receiving her family's money in perpetuity. In exchange, the Duke agreed to legal separation. They would live apart, She would retain her title as Duchess of Marlborough. He would maintain custody of their sons, but allow regular visitation. The marriage was over in everything except legal technicality. The separation was formalized in 1921. Consuelo left Blenheim Palace for the final time, walking out of the building she had saved twice with money she had never controlled. She moved to London initially, then to France, deliberately putting distance between herself and the estate that had consumed 25 years of her life. But separation was not divorce. She could not remarry. She could not fully escape the title that had been purchased at such cost. British law still recognized the Duke as her husband. It still bound her legally to a man who was now openly planning to marry Gladys Deakin as soon as Consuelo could be completely erased from his life. She needed more than separation. She needed annulment. A legal declaration that the marriage had never been valid, that she had been coerced, that the entire transaction had been criminal from the beginning. The evidence was overwhelming. Her mother's threats, the doctor's convenient diagnoses, her age at the time of the wedding, the financial negotiations that had treated her as merchandise, the Duke's own statements about marrying for money. Consuelo had been documenting all of it for years. Now she would use it to achieve what British law had denied her, freedom from a marriage that should never have been permitted. In 1926, the Catholic Church granted an annulment, not because divorce laws had changed, but because the Church's own investigation had determined the marriage was contracted under duress. Consuelo had been 18 years old, legally a minor under American law. She had been threatened, confined, and psychologically tortured into compliance. The wedding at St. Thomas Church had not been a sacrament. It had been a coerced contract that violated every principle of free consent the Church claimed to require for valid marriage. The annulment document spelled out the coercion in detail: Alva's faked heart condition, the 5 days of confinement, the interception of Consuelo's correspondence, the Duke's admission that he had married for financial rescue. Every horrible detail was recorded officially, validated legally, and preserved permanently. Consuelo's truth was now written into church records. She had been sold. Everyone now knew it. And the institution that had blessed the original crime had finally admitted what it had helped accomplish. The Duke was furious. Annulment meant their son's legitimacy could be questioned. It meant his second marriage to Gladys Deakin, which he was planning to pursue immediately, would be seen as his first valid marriage. It meant the world now knew he had essentially purchased his first wife and driven her away through cruelty and neglect. His reputation, which he had guarded so carefully, was damaged permanently by the truth of what he had done. Consuelo did not care about his reputation. She cared about her freedom. And in 1927, she remarried. Her second husband was Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrialist. He had money of his own. He did not need her fortune. He married her because he loved her, a concept so foreign to her first marriage that it took her months to believe it was real. At 50 years old, Consuelo Vanderbilt finally experienced what marriage was supposed to be. She had paid for Blenheim Palace twice, once with her initial dowry, once with the separation trust. The building she had saved would consume Vanderbilt money forever, but she was finally free of it, free of the Duke, free of the title that had cost her youth, free to live the life her mother had stolen from her 32 years earlier. The escape was complete. The price had been paid, and Consuelo walked away from the most expensive real estate transaction of her life. Chapter 10: The Woman Who Rebuilt Herself. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent her fortune buying a palace, then spent her freedom learning how to live without one. Her second marriage to Jacques Balsan was everything her first marriage had not been: partnership, affection, the simple pleasure of being chosen for herself rather than for her bank account. They lived in France, in comfortable houses that required no armies of servants, no constant performance of aristocratic status. She could wear what she wanted, say what she thought, and spend her days however she chose. At 50 years old, she experienced autonomy for the first time since childhood. She threw herself into work that mattered. During World War I, she had discovered that helping others gave her purpose beyond being decorative. Now, in the years between the wars, as she expanded that work, she funded hospitals in France. She supported educational programs for poor children. She used her remaining fortune, the portion that had not been consumed by Blenheim, to build things that helped people rather than preserve buildings. The relationship with her sons, complicated by years of separation and their father's influence, slowly rebuilt itself. John, the eldest, had inherited the dukedom when the 9th Duke died in 1934. He understood better than most what his mother had sacrificed. He invited her to visit Blenheim, not as the wronged duchess, but as an honored guest. She returned occasionally, walking through rooms she had saved, seeing them maintained by the trust she had funded. The palace was beautiful. She felt nothing for it except exhausted satisfaction that it still stood. Ivor, and her younger son, maintained closer contact. He had witnessed more of the marriage's dysfunction, being younger and more observant. He told Consuelo years later that he had always known his father had been cruel, that he had understood even as a child that his mother deserved better. The conversation did not repair the lost time, but it acknowledged truth. And for Consuelo, acknowledgement was more valuable than apology. In 1952, at 75 years old, she published her memoir. The book was titled The Glitter and the Gold, and it told her story with the controlled rage of someone who had waited decades to speak freely. She described the coercion, the faked heart attack, the wedding where she cried so hard she could barely speak her vows, the marriage that had treated her as inventory, the Duke's affairs and financial manipulation. Every detail she had documented was now public record. The memoir caused scandal in both America and Britain. Aristocratic society claimed she was exaggerating, that marriages of her era were simply different, that she was applying modern standards to historical arrangements. But women who had lived through similar experiences wrote her letters saying thank you. Thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for admitting that fairy tale marriages to dukes were often nightmares disguised as dreams. Thank you for refusing to protect the institutions that had sacrificed you. The book sold well. Readers were fascinated by the glimpse into aristocratic dysfunction. But Consuelo had not written it for money or fame. She had written it to reclaim her narrative. For 60 years, the story of her marriage had been told by others. Society pages celebrating a romantic union. Historical accounts describing the preservation of Blenheim. Tourist guides mentioning the American duchess who had brought Vanderbilt money to England. Now, finally, she could tell what had actually happened. The bride who cried, the mother who coerced, the duke who bought, the palace that consumed, the woman who survived. She reconciled with the memory of her mother in complicated ways. Alva had died in 1933, unrepentant about her methods and proud of her daughter's achieved rank. Consuelo had not forgiven her, but she had come to understand her. Alva had been shaped by a society that taught women their worth, came from the men they married, She had internalized that lesson so completely that she had sacrificed her daughter to it. The system had victimized them both, even as Alva had enforced its cruelest requirements. Consuelo lived to see the world change in ways that made her own experience increasingly incomprehensible. Women gained the vote, gained property rights, gained the legal ability to leave abusive marriages without losing their children or their fortunes. The structures that had imprisoned her were slowly dismantled, not because institutions suddenly became moral, but because women fought for decades to change laws that treated them as property. She died in 1964 at 87 years old. She had outlived the Duke by 30 years. She had outlived most of the people who had witnessed her forced marriage. She had outlived the social system that had produced such transactions. In her final years, she lived quietly in New York, returning to the city where she had been sold, finally able to walk its streets as a free woman, rather than as merchandise being prepared for auction. Her obituaries focused on her title, the American heiress who became a duchess, the Vanderbilt who married a Churchill, the woman who helped save Blenheim Palace. These facts were true but incomplete. They described what had been done to her and what she had funded. They did not describe who she had been. A girl who loved someone her mother would not permit. A wife who survived a marriage that should have destroyed her. A woman who paid twice for the same palace and finally learned to live without caring whether it stood or fell. The full story was more complicated than any obituary could capture, but at least now it had been told in her own words, preserved in a memoir that would outlast the palace she had been sold to save. Chapter 11, The Palace That Forgot Her Name. Today, 1 million visitors tour Blenheim Palace annually, and almost none of them know who paid to save it. The tour guides mention Winston Churchill, born at Blenheim in 1874, Britain's wartime prime minister and literary icon. They describe the first Duke of Marlborough, military genius who defeated the French and earned a grateful nation's gift of land and construction funds. They point out architectural details designed by John Vanbrugh, the Baroque grandeur that makes Blenheim unique among English country houses. They discuss the palace's designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the few private residences to receive that honor. What they do not discuss is Consuelo Vanderbilt. The current palace valuation exceeds £150 million. That figure accounts for the building, the art collection, the 2,700-acre estate, and the historical significance that draws tourists from across the world. But it does not account for the human cost of preservation. The woman who was sold to fund the restoration that kept Blenheim standing long enough to become a heritage site. The fortune that stabilized the estate during its most vulnerable period. The trust that still generates maintenance income a century after it was established. There is a portrait of Consuelo in the Green Writing Room. Painted by Giovanni Boldini in 1896, shortly after her marriage, it shows her in elegant dress with the expression of someone performing grace under unbearable pressure. The portrait is beautiful and deeply sad. Tour groups walk past it quickly, following guides who are explaining the room's history as a space where the first Duchess wrote letters. They do not stop to discuss why the 9th Duchess looks so haunted. The restoration work she financed continues to protect the building. Between 2000 and 2010 alone, £3 million were spent on roof repairs, using income from the perpetual trust established when Consuelo bought her freedom. The electrical system installed with her initial dowry has been updated and expanded, but its foundation remains the wiring paid for in the 1890s. The staterooms she funded are now the centerpiece of public tours, photographed endlessly by visitors who admire Baroque decoration, without knowing an American teenager's fortune made its preservation possible. The ninth Duke died in 1934 and was buried at Blenheim with full aristocratic ceremony. His obituaries praised his stewardship of the palace, his political career, his dedication to preserving his family's heritage. They mentioned his second marriage to Gladys Deakin, which had lasted 11 unhappy years before ending in her mental collapse and institutionalization. They did not dwell on his first marriage, except to note that Consuelo Vanderbilt had been an American heiress who brought substantial wealth to the estate. The word substantial carried no specific number. The coercion was not mentioned. The transaction that saved Blenheim was smoothed into a pleasant historical anecdote about transatlantic marriage. The current Duke, John George Vanderbilt Henry Spencer Churchill, is the 12th to hold the title. He inherited Blenheim in 2014 and continues the work of preservation and management. The estate operates as a tourist attraction, event venue, and historical monument. Annual revenue from tickets, weddings, and commercial activities funds ongoing maintenance. The palace that once demanded a human sacrifice now sustains itself through capitalism and heritage tourism. But underneath the modern business operations runs the original trust. Consuelo's money, invested over a century ago, still generates income that flows into Blenheim's accounts. The amount is smaller now relative to total operational costs. Inflation and changing financial structures have reduced its proportional significance. But the legal arrangement persists. Vanderbilt money still pays for Churchill preservation. The transaction never ends. The palace remembers what it chooses to remember. It remembers military victory. It remembers architectural innovation. It remembers the first Duke's genius and the first Duchess's patronage. It does not remember the ninth Duchess's tears or the marriage negotiated like a corporate merger. Those details are not good for tourism. They complicate the narrative of aristocratic grandeur and historical importance. Better to focus on beauty and achievement than on the systems that produced both through human suffering. In the palace archives, documents tell the story that tours omit. Marriage contracts spelling out financial terms, trust agreements establishing perpetual funding, separation negotiations revealing decades of dysfunction, letters from Consuelo to her sons describing the loneliness of her marriage, the Duke's correspondence with lawyers discussing how to extract maximum value from his American wife. The evidence exists for anyone willing to look, but most visitors come to admire architecture, not to excavate uncomfortable truths about how it was saved. Consuelo's portrait hangs in the green writing room, beautiful and sad, watching visitors walk past without recognition. The palace she saved does not honor her sacrifice. It simply stands, magnificent and indifferent, consuming maintenance funds and welcoming tourists who marvel at its grandeur without asking what it cost, or who paid, or whether beauty justified the price demanded. Miss Blenheim Palace survived because an 18-year-old girl was sold to save it. Today, 1 million visitors tour annually, and almost none of them know her name. Chapter 12. The Price of Palaces. Every great house hides a human cost in its foundation, but few demand payment as explicitly as Blenheim. Between 1870 and 1914, over 500 American heiresses married European aristocrats in transactions that transferred approximately $220 million across the Atlantic. Each marriage followed the same pattern. Impoverished aristocrat needed capital. Ambitious American family needed social legitimacy. daughter became the medium of exchange, her fortune traded for a title, her happiness considered irrelevant to the transaction's success. The system was so widespread, so normalized, and so enthusiastically supported by society that it operated openly without shame or legal challenge. The economics were brutally simple. British estates could not sustain themselves. Agricultural depression had destroyed rental income. Inheritance taxes consumed generational wealth. Maintenance costs for massive country houses exceeded what the land could produce. Meanwhile, American industrial fortunes were growing at unprecedented rates. Railroads, steel, banking, oil, families accumulated wealth faster than they could spend it, but wealth alone did not grant social acceptance. The established families who controlled American high society treated new money with contempt. European titles offered a solution. Marry an earl, and suddenly your questionable origins mattered less than your aristocratic connections. The women caught in this system had no legal recourse. American married women's property laws were evolving slowly during this period. Some states granted wives limited control over their own earnings or inheritances. But most financial arrangements transferred wealth from father to husband through the daughter, who served as legal conduit but retained no control. British law was even more explicit. Husbands owned their wives' property absolutely. A woman's fortune became her husband's fortune at marriage. She could not reclaim it through separation or divorce without his consent. The legal structures treated her as a perpetual minor, incapable of managing her own affairs, existing primarily to transfer wealth and produce heirs. The churches blessed these arrangements without asking questions about consent or coercion. Protestant and Catholic ceremonies both required the bride to promise obedience. The wedding vows themselves encoded the power imbalance. She would love, honor, and obey. He would love and cherish. One partner promised submission. The other promised affection as a conditional gift. When a bride cried through her wedding as Consuelo did, witnesses interpreted it as feminine emotion, not as the visible distress of someone being forced into legal slavery. Blenheim Palace stands today because this system worked exactly as designed. An American fortune was identified. A duchess title was offered. The negotiation proceeded smoothly. The money was transferred. The palace was saved. That the duchess spent decades in misery was unfortunate, but irrelevant. The building survived. From a preservation standpoint, the transaction was successful. The fact that it destroyed a woman in the process did not diminish the architectural achievement. We are left with impossible questions. Should we celebrate Blenheim's survival? The palace is genuinely magnificent. Its Baroque architecture represents a pinnacle of English design. Its historical significance as the birthplace of Winston Churchill adds layers of meaning beyond pure aesthetics. It employs hundreds of people. It educates millions of visitors about British history and architectural heritage. Its existence has objective value, but that value was purchased through institutionalized coercion. A teenager was sold. Her autonomy was stolen. Her fortune was extracted. Her suffering made the preservation possible. Can we separate the beauty from the brutality that saved it? And museums worldwide struggle with this question about artifacts acquired through colonialism or theft. Blenheim presents a parallel problem. The building itself did nothing wrong. The architecture is innocent. But the system that rescued it from collapse was criminal by any modern standard. Enjoying the palace requires either ignoring how it was saved or accepting that sometimes beauty requires human sacrifice. The transatlantic marriage market ended not because society developed morality, but because economics changed. World War I bankrupted many aristocratic families completely. Death duties and tax reforms made it impossible to maintain massive estates, even with American fortunes. The social prestige of European titles declined as American society matured and developed its own elite structures. By the 1920s, ambitious American families could achieve social dominance without purchasing dukes. The market collapsed because supply and demand shifted, not because anyone admitted the transactions had been wrong. Consuelo Vanderbilt survived to see the system that destroyed her become obsolete. She lived long enough to publish her memoir and tell her truth. She outlasted the Duke, outlasted her mother, outlasted most of the institutions that had sacrificed her. That survival was its own form of victory. But it did not undo the damage. It did not restore the youth she lost or the happiness she was denied. It simply proved that some people refuse to be completely broken by the systems designed to break them. Blenheim Palace will outlast everyone involved in its salvation. The building will stand for centuries, maintained by trusts and tourism revenue and ongoing preservation efforts. Future generations will tour its rooms, admire its architecture, and learn about its history. They will know about the first Duke's military victories. They will know about Winston Churchill's birth in a ground-floor bedroom. They will see Consuelo Vanderbilt's portrait and perhaps learn she was an American heiress who married the 9th Duke. What they will not understand, unless they dig into archives and read her memoir and examine the documents, is the full truth. She did not marry the Duke. She was sold to him. This was not a love match that happened to involve money. It was a real estate transaction that happened to involve a human being. Every great palace hides costs in its foundation. Labor extracted from workers who built it. Resources diverted from communities that needed them. Environmental damage from landscapes transformed into ornamental gardens. But few palaces demand payment as explicitly as Blenheim. The building itself is beautiful. The system that saved it was monstrous. Both facts are true. Both facts matter. And the uncomfortable reality is this: we still visit the palace. We still admire its grandeur. We still celebrate its preservation. We benefit from the transaction, even as we acknowledge its horror. Beauty is never free. Someone always pays. At Blenheim Palace, an 18-year-old girl named Consuelo Vanderbilt paid with her freedom, her happiness, and 25 years of her life. The building she saved stands today as both architectural masterpiece and monument to institutionalized cruelty. We can admire it. We can visit it. We can marvel at its Baroque splendor and historical significance. But we cannot pretend the cost was acceptable or the transaction was just. The palace survived. The question remains whether that survival justified what was demanded to achieve it.